Brilliant. Thank you very much. So this is about tea at sunrise. First of all, it's very similar to JustGESI itself. It's part of the Transforming Energy Access platform that is funded by UK aid from the UK government and supports the technologies, business models and skills needed to enable a just and inclusive clean energy transition. So we're also one of the UK's Ayrton Challenges, and that's the a government funded initiative with 12 projects dedicated to advancing clean energy in lower income and developing countries around the world. It's focused on next generation solar power, and that basically is about exploring newer, more efficient solar technologies that go beyond today's standard panels that are mainly silicon based. So we're led by Swansea University, and that's actually where Aelwyn and I are based. And we're also in collaboration, as you mentioned, with partner countries across Africa, Asia, and the Indo-Pacific, though our network is actually much broader than that. So as I said, we aim to accelerate clean energy access that leaves no one behind, and that's the key bit here. And we're doing that via supporting the early stage testing, manufacture, and scale up of new solar technologies. So we're building an international and inclusive network to be able to carry out those activities. And we have researchers and experts from multiple disciplines, industry, policy, practice, all hopefully working in collaboration to tackle this, this energy access challenge. So thank you. If I can have the next slide, please. So this is our network. In fact, the slide before showed our network in our first meeting in Durban in 2025. We started in 2024 and a little bit of issues trying to get people and contracts in place, but we are now storming ahead with our activities. And as I said, we held the first symposium in Durban in January 2025, and this here in the image is our second symposium in Kuala Lumpur earlier in January this year. The image on the right is actually an interactive map from our website, and if you click on those little pinpoints, you actually find out a little bit of detail about the people behind those points on the map. Oh, it sounds like somebody's got building work going on in the background. So anyway, so as I said, since we started, we've got this growing global network, and that's across disciplines, academia, policy practice, and also, as I mentioned, beyond these original partner countries. So if I can have the the next slide, please. So this is a little bit about what we get up to during our Tea at Sunrise activities. And I'll only go through these in brief because I think hopefully people want to hear the bulk of the report that we're starting. But we hold monthly themed webinars, and in fact we had one this morning. And that basically is our network members or people that we're interested in hearing from who can provide information and more knowledge to our network. We launched the Women in Solar Energy, or the WISE group. We've had 6 meetings, so it must have been 6 months ago. They're also 6 monthly, and that was in response to requirements from within the network. And I can give people more details about that later on after we finish the presentation if you're interested, and I'm sure there might well be people who would like to join that group. Also, before I forget, at the end of the presentation there will be a link to our network, so all of the information that I'm sharing now is actually on our website, and you can look at that at your leisure. So one of the other activities that we carry out are tea breaks, and that's the image at the bottom of the screen. And essentially that's sort of like a little mini podcast or chat between somebody from Tea at Sunrise and a network member to learn more about them and their activities, all in a succinct time frame, like 10 to 15 minutes, so you can sit and have your cup of tea or coffee and listen to that tea break. We've been involved in successful bids amongst the network for future research funding. We're involved in knowledge exchange, and that's not just information like the reports, etc. It's actually physical transfers of people. The top image there is are some of the people that have visited our labs in Swansea. One, John, was from Nigeria, and he was learning about cell development within our labs here to be able to reproduce the same in the labs in Futo in Nigeria. And we also had in that image that we've got two of the Chevening scholars that had come to have a look at what goes on in our labs and to meet us. So we have international recognition, we carry out goal setting. So we are planning to, with the Nigeria and the Futo team, to develop the first next generation solar module, as I said, in Nigeria. And we have a symposia and network growth. So I think we're at 300 plus members in our network now. So it's all very exciting. And as I said, yeah, very, very exciting times as people are joining in and seeing the value of it. So, well, thank you. So this is a little bit about us. So I didn't actually come into solar energy space through engineering. I came through health and community development fields. I trained and worked as a radiographer, then moved into industry, training other practitioners and testing medical technologies. So this gave me sort of an early exposure to how technical systems are adopted or not in practice. So I worked in community development before moving into academia somewhat later in life by many standards. And I spent over a decade in gerontology and dementia research when I was, after doing my PhD, working closely with communities and exploring how research and systems either include or exclude people, particularly in later life. So what's consistent is my interest really in participation and lived experience and how institutional decisions shape real world access. So I moved into the solar energy space from a public involvement and participatory approaches perspective. So I'm asking similar questions that we're asking now in this report. Who are the systems designed for? Who is a voice in shaping it? And what happens if we fail to consider those on the margin? So I'm now going to hand over to Aelwyn to do his introduction.
Yeah, I'm quite similar to Carol, really. I come from a non-engineering background. I've worked as a teacher, I've worked as a project officer, I've worked in several different sectors before landing kind of in academia. And I've kind of worked mainly as a social scientist and a qualitative researcher, you know, for the last, I guess, 20 years or so. My work, much like Carol, I mean, recently it's spanned aging and dementia research, community energy, human geography, and international development as well. And I guess it's that last strand that brings me here today to an extent, as well as the kind of community energy interest, is thinking about who gets included in the solar value chains and who doesn't. And I think probably we need to, before we kind of proceed with this, we should also acknowledge our own kind of positionality in presenting this work, because we're both, you know, white British social scientists working within institutions that may have historically actually benefited from the very colonial structures that we're critiquing in the presentation. So we kind of recognise that we speak from positions of relative privilege. That the barriers we're discussing disproportionately affect communities across Africa, Asia, and the Indo-Pacific. The regions, you know, some of you know intimately through lived experience and grounded research. So our role in this, in synthesizing this report, has been to try to centre the voices, scholarship, and documented experiences of those directly impacted by those injustices. Next slide, please.
So back to me again for there we are. Yeah, thank you. So that now we're moving on to the body of the work really, and the report that we've developed, the barriers to inclusivity in the solar value chain. So we believe that the equitable transition can only happen when it includes the voices and contributions of those most impacted by inequality, as I hope we've explained there. And we have to prioritise gender, equality, disability and inclusion, or JESI. So we want to create solutions that are not only technically sound, but also socially just. And this commitment ensures that throughout our activities, we will consider the potential benefits and also the harms for all. So if we have the next slide, please. So basically this is our aim, our mission statements, why inclusivity matters. And this is also forms the basis of, as I said, of our mission statement that we will commit to inclusion throughout our activities, and it also is the starting point of our JustGESI strategy throughout Tea at Sunrise. So if we have the next slide, please. So, and this is where I do feel sort of painfully aware that I am preaching to the choir to an extent with a JustGESI audience here. But we have taken a JustGESI lens when we've looked at the barriers to inclusivity, and and this is basically because we have to determine right from the outset who benefits and who is excluded. So we understand gender as not just a demographic variable. There are persistent patterns of women in low paid or informal roles with limited access to training, decision making, finance. Women are often underrepresented in engineering and in technical segments of the solar value chain. So the implication as well as we move on into intersectionality, and I'm going to cover this in a little bit more detail later on too, but it's a way of understanding how different forms of inequality and discrimination overlap, interact, and compound each other. So we have multiple identities: gender, race, class, caste, disability, age, sexuality, religion, nationality, etc. And these identities intersect, shaping people's experiences. So systems of power exist in different places as well. So it may not be just at the macro level or at a country level. It might happen on a more local basis in communities. And there are often marginalized communities, maybe women, Indigenous peoples, persons with a disability, and other groups that aren't believed, heard, or taken seriously as a source of knowledge. And that's where we talk about epistemic injustice. And this can really happen in a couple of ways. The result is that from this denying people a place at the table, you can actually have knowledge, valuable knowledge and perspectives that are systematically excluded, silenced, or basically undervalued. And that's because of the power structures that are in place determine whose knowledge matters. And that reinforces inequality by denying certain marginalized communities credibility. So if we have the next slide, please. So when we looked at our research, and first of all, I just want to say that the literature we reviewed was academic literature, grey literature. We also had lots of discussions with our network members and partners. So we pulled together our reports looking at the structural inequalities across the solar value chain, and we identified 3 core systems of internet-connected systemic barriers, and we're going to look at these in a little bit more detail now. So basically, these structures and systems and barriers that are in place currently shape access to resources, decisions, and benefits. And our report really aims to, by highlighting these, to then be able to begin to address them, which was what we're doing in a second bit of paper later on, but we'll talk about that again later on. But again, in talking about the literature that we reviewed, it does primarily focus on women. That's what happens within the literature that we've noted, and there are specific organisations that are highlighting some of the issues that women are experiencing. But we must also, at the same time, when we're looking at inclusivity, look at low-income groups, Indigenous and other marginalised communities, such as forest-dependent communities, lower caste and ethnic minorities, migrant labourers and informal workers, people with disabilities, older adults. And when we look at things with the JustGESI lens, that can help identify intersecting forms of exclusion. But as I said, most of the data that we are presenting is more specifically around women within that role, but we must try and also constantly keep in the back of our mind that there are other groups that are consistently marginalised and excluded. So if we move on to slide 10. Oh, sorry, next slide. Don't suppose you've got slide 10 mark there. So this is another brief explainer here for those who, like me, didn't necessarily know what the full extent of the solar value chain comprises of. And we basically found that there are differences when you look in the literature as well, and also when we spoke to people with the network, that people have slightly different interpretations of what these boxes mean. But essentially, there's an upstream, a midstream, a downstream, and an auxiliary or ancillary. So when we look at the upstream aspects of the solar value chain, we are looking at the raw material extraction. So that's the critical minerals that are used in the development and the production of ingots and wafers. And then we move on to the midstream, which is the cell and module production and the manufacturing of the solar panels, and that also includes some of the components such as the frame and the cables, etc., and some of the transportation of the completed modules into panels into the downstream section, and that's around the installation, operation and maintenance, and the end of life of the panels, so when they are no longer working or when they are due to be replaced for whatever reason. So the auxiliary aspects are also essential to the entire process. So that's around the research and development, finance, training, regulation, policy. But it isn't as clear-cut, as I said, as these little boxes, and it is not just a technical process. So the solar value chain can be analysed as a spatial and political geography of power. It's one that often mirrors the historical patterns of colonial extraction, where raw materials flow from the global south. And in fact, one of our network members has shown that in the continent of Africa, most of the critical minerals for developing solar panels are present. But it's where the materials flow from global south to manufacturing centres, often in the global north. And it's where the value is attributed to these different sections as well. And there are different, more profitable sections or concentrated among actors who are inherited advantages from the colonial era industrialisation. So I'm not going to go hugely into these figures at the bottom because they will be covered a little bit later during the presentation as well. But just a little bit, so we think that about 97% of global panels may contain forced labour components made by Uyghur forced labourers. And this obviously represents a profound ethical crisis that threatens the legitimacy of clean energy transitions. So that's the large number where the panels containing the forced labour components potentially, and the smaller number is the amount of money that's actually in place and supporting the just transitions. So if I move on to the next slide, that'd be great. Thank you. So now I'm just going to talk about the first of those barriers, the gender as a system of power. So understanding barriers to women and the other groups that I mentioned earlier requires analysing how patriarchy intersects with race, class, caste, indigeneity and colonial history to create this compounded exclusions. So our consideration of or understanding of gender at T, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just a demographic variable, but a dynamic system of power relations, historically shaped. And we maintain that such patterns persist in areas of the contemporary solar value chain. So if we move on to the next slide. So as I mentioned, sort of barriers are cumulative and they begin long before women actually enter the solar value workforce. So there are education and skills gaps. Girls are often steered away from STEM subjects, and it requires analysing how patriarchy interacts here. So it says there that during secondary education, there are many women who don't actually achieve or go into secondary education because of cultural or patriarchal behaviours and patterns of expectations. Sorry, going off on one there. Yeah, and there's often discriminatory advice and suggestions of picking up jobs and roles that steer people away from STEM subjects and working within the solar roles, etc. Also masculine workplace cultures. There's and this is across the scheme, from manufacturing, installation and maintenance, and some of the papers that we were looking at it explained how people can't actually get entry into these jobs because of the networks that they were denied from the outset. Also, sexual harassment and male-dominated recruitment networks can mean it's difficult to rise up within the workplaces if people do actually get there. And again, I'm not going to go into the others in detail because they will be covered in another part when Aelwyn takes over. But women are frequently excluded from household energy decisions, despite the fact that they are often the main users of energy within a household, where male landowners are typically engaged. Financial exclusion, a similar prospect with limited land ownership within women, and similarly reduced financial decision-making powers. So I wanted to give a little bit of a scenario here about intersectionality and to bring that alive a little more. So imagine a 19-year-old scheduled caste woman who lives in a small agricultural village in northern India. As a woman in a patriarchal rural society, she may face expectations to leave school early, marry young. She might have to prioritise domestic labour over education or work. Her caste identity may mean that she faces social segregation. Because she is young, her decision-making power may be limited. Living in a rural area adds structural constraints. There are fewer school and job opportunities and transport. So this intersectional analysis shows that her exclusion results from multiple intersecting systems. Together, these create a unique form of disadvantage that will mean that her experience is quite different from others. So each individual may experience inequality differently. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So I'm just going to give a little bit more information here particularly about this case study in Bangladesh, and that was one of the figures that I mentioned in the slide earlier. So this case study is from a paper by Henson and Peake in 2017, and it's called Training and Integrating Rural Women into Technology, a study of renewable energy technology in Bangladesh. And it talks of a USAID-funded training project by Graeme Shakti, I think is how you say it, and that's a major renewable energy technology enterprise in Bangladesh. And they revealed that despite training nearly 2,800 rural women in Bangladesh to participate in a solar home system value chain, there were improved skills and there were some livelihood opportunities. Nevertheless, fewer than 3% of the women afterwards were employed in the sector post-training. And this was due to persistent cultural barriers and structural limitations in project design and markets. So training does not equal participation. So despite these women receiving the technical training across the solar home system, 91% of them ended up in the assembly work, and that is often deemed or considered as slightly less technical and consequently less well paid, whereas the 91% of the installation was done by men. So it reminds us that the sector remains rigidly gender segmented despite these training initiatives. So the promises of green jobs and solar employment disproportionately goes to external male workers, and local communities, particularly women, are largely bypassed. So women are structurally confined to lower paid assembly roles, even when they hold technical qualifications. And this reflects socio-cultural assumptions, not capabilities. So if I can have the next slide, please. Oh, sorry, that moves on to Aelwyn. He'll be glad to hear it.
Thanks, Carol. That's me. Yeah, thanks. Okay, then. So exploring this second barrier takes us into territory which I think that sometimes makes people feel a bit uncomfortable, but it's essential that we kind of name it quite clearly, really. So that's looking at the colonial aspects, the colonial spatial patterns that you've got in this, and the kind of epistemic and justice issues. Now, what we mean is that we think that the geography of the solar value chain, where things are extracted, where they're manufactured, where profits accumulate, often reproduces those old colonial divisions that we've seen over the centuries. And alongside this, there's a systematic devaluing of the kind of knowledge from the global south, or even, I'm not sure even global south is what we should be using these days. I kind of like the most of world way of calling it, really. Right, next slide, please. So I'll kind of break it down into two interconnected dynamics, and there will be some repetition in these sections from what Carol's just said. Now, first, we can call we can call something called we can call it the colonial echo, if you like, what I've just alluded to. The most profitable segments of the solar value chain, the technology development, the advanced manufacturing, R&D, they remain overwhelmingly concentrated in the global north and in China. Meanwhile, the global south provides the raw material, the land, a lot of the low-skilled labour, and of course the sites for solar deployment. Now, many in our network work in African countries that are really rich in critical minerals, so cobalt, lithium, rare earths, and these are all essential for solar technologies. And yet these countries capture minimal value from the solar projects deployed on their land. The parallel to historical and colonial extraction is basically unmistakable. Raw materials flow north, profits stay north, but the burden remains in the south. Secondly, there's the issue of epistemic injustice. So Western technical knowledge dominates solar R&D, it dominates policy frameworks, and it seems that indigenous knowledge, so that's particularly women's ecological expertise about land use, about sustainable resource management, about community energy needs, this is often systematically devalued or ignored entirely. So we've got to ask really, whose knowledge shapes solar systems, whose priorities drive innovation, whose needs are actually being addressed? Too often, I think the answer is that it's already the people who hold power in this world. And this is the risk that we're facing, really, what researchers call the resource curse, which I'm sure some of you will have heard of here. So countries rich in critical minerals may enable wealthy countries' energy transitions while their own populations continue to lack basic energy access. This is not hypothetical, as I'm sure you all know, this is clearly already happening. And it echoes exactly how colonial extraction impoverished resource-rich territories for generations. So I'm going to give you two concrete examples now with the next slides. So the next slide, please. Yeah. Okay then. So first of all, this is one paper that we looked at, or in fact, there's a couple of papers on this. The Badla Solar Park in Rajasthan in India. Now, internationally, it's celebrated as a success story. It's one of the world's largest solar installations. It's seen as a kind of a shining example even of renewable energy at scale. But lots of research, for example, these papers by Stock and Savakul, on the ground, they found a very, very different picture. So despite this international acclaim, as always, local revenues seem to flow elsewhere. The park generates considerable profits for developers and operators, but Badla's own economic situation has actually worsened. So the local community experiences all the burdens. They've lost the land, there's environmental impacts, there's disrupted agricultural livelihoods, but they receive almost no compensation through employment because jobs are often short-term or go to outsiders, and there's no real improved energy access for them locally, and certainly no revenue sharing. So, I mean, this is a prime example of the kind of, of an extractive relationship where rural and marginalized communities provide the land, they provide the spatial foundation for development projects, but it's external actors who capture the benefits. And there's distinct gendered dimensions to this as well, which are quite profound, really. Very often, when you've got solar parks displacing agriculture or common lands, it's the women who lose crucial sources of autonomy. So they're gathering fuel, grazing animals, growing food. Yet compensation schemes, if they do exist, typically only recognise formal land titles, which are usually held by men. So women's use rights become invisible and uncompensated. So, we can really sort of look at this and say, really question whether it's a success. If it is a success, then we have to ask for whom. Right, next slide, please. So we can go even further upstream here, looking at, in the value chain to that extraction of raw materials. Now, many of you probably will know this already. Obviously, silica sand is essential for solar panel production. It's fundamental. And much of it comes from regions like Uttar Pradesh in India, where mining displaces forest-dependent communities, unfortunately. The Kol tribe, which is an indigenous community whose livelihoods depend on the forest resources, are facing the loss of land, the loss of traditional subsistence activities, and of course, the environmental destruction that mining brings everywhere, really. So who bears the greatest burden within the coal tribe? Well, again, it's the women and children. When they face hazardous working conditions, when they do find employment in the mines, they experience the most severe health impacts from environmental degradation. And this is exactly what we have to sit with, really. This extraction serves global north decarbonisation goals. Solar panels are installed in Europe, in North America, in wealthy countries, but they may well contain silica extracted under these conditions. So when we talk about colonial patterns, this is what we mean, really. The burdens of extraction fall on marginalised communities in the global south, but the benefits of clean energy accrue in the global north, which brings us to our third systematic barrier. Next slide, please. So barrier 3 is about the structural, financial and procedural exclusions that take place in this solar value chain. It's about how financing systems, land ownership patterns and consultation processes work together to systematically exclude women and other marginalised groups from meaningful participation in solar transitions. Next slide, please. Now, these exclusions operate at multiple interconnected levels. So, it's quite a complicated slide here, but let me walk you through it. So first of all, there's financial exclusion, which we've already alluded to. In sub-Saharan Africa, women frequently don't own land, have limited assets, have less formal education, and restricted mobility. Now, all of this undermines their financial credibility also in the eyes of lenders and investors. So collateral requirements often exclude women who've been historically denied property through patriarchal inheritance laws. You can't put up land as collateral if the land was never yours to begin with. And even modern innovations like pay-go systems can reproduce these exclusions. Why? Well, because their credit scoring algorithms privilege formal employment patterns, which systematically disadvantage women who work in informal sectors, who have caregiving responsibilities, or who face interrupted employment. Secondly, you've got procedural exclusion. So community consultations for solar projects typically engage only male landowners, according to some of the literature that we've seen. Women's voices are simply absent from the room. Again, why? Why is this? Well, women face barriers to attending public meetings because of things like caregiving responsibilities. That they mean that they can't leave home. The restrictions on mobility. There are social norms, obviously, that say women shouldn't speak in mixed gatherings. So a lot of the time, projects get designed without understanding actual community energy needs properly, particularly women's needs. And this means that, solar infrastructure often doesn't actually serve the people it's meant to benefit. Though you will hear of examples of this later on in this presentation that really buck this trend. And then thirdly, you've got policy gaps, so-called gender blind policies that appear neutral on the surface, but systematically advantage men. For example, solar subsidies that require property ownership, which is what we've alluded to before. Now, it sounds reasonable, right? But in the context where women overwhelmingly don't own property, then this automatically excludes most of them. And crucially, there's usually weak implementation and accountability mechanisms that even when you've got inclusive policies, ones that exist on paper at least, exclusionary practice continue on the ground. In practice, this means something called energy unfreedoms. That's a term that Stock and Nyataki Frimpong used to describe what happened at the Kalea Laura solar plant in Ghana. Next slide, please. So their research on Ghana's Kalea Laura solar plant illustrates how large-scale solar development produces such energy unfreedoms, as they term it. Local communities, again, particularly women, face dispossession without promised benefits. Most skilled roles in this particular plant in Ghana went to non-local men, perpetuating not only that, but gendered exclusion and colonial spatial patterns where rural communities provide land, low-skilled labour, while skilled employment and profits flow to the urban centres and external actors. Again, women bore the primary costs of the dispossession that happened here in Ghana, losing access to land and resources while being completely shut out of the skilled employment and decision making. So the promise was light, energy, access and development, but the reality was dispossession and exclusion once more. So women were often confined to what the researchers call feminized service roles, cooking, cleaning, support work. So this is what Stock and Neotani Frimpong call, energy and freedom. Clean energy projects which actually reduce people's autonomy and economic security. Okay, on to the next one. So I guess we really need to address what is perhaps the most profound ethical crisis facing solar transitions today, the forced labour in the supply chain, which we acknowledge happens across Africa, Asia and the Indo-Pacific. However, I guess one of the largest or the most well-documented cases of this is the use of Uyghur forced labour in polysilicon production. This represents a fundamental challenge to the legitimacy of so-called clean energy. Research from Sheffield Hallam University shows that at the time of their investigation, 40 to 45% of global polysilicon comes from the Xinjiang region of China. So this is very recent research. It's probably still ongoing in terms of that reach. So up to 97% of global solar PV panels may contain components tainted by forced labour. That's what they found in the reports. So many companies, that claiming clean supply chains lack any credible evidence to support those claims. Corporate due diligence remains largely voluntary, according to these, very detailed actually reports. They're well worth reading. They're largely, due diligence remains largely voluntary, superficial. And we know also from these reports that Uyghur women face specific gendered forms of coercion and violence within this system. So what's the implication of this? I think we have to recognise that, again, the colonial parallels. The targeting of Uyghur Muslims, an ethnic and religious minority, reflects how racial and religious difference has historically been used to justify super exploitation. You could argue that from plantation slavery to indentured labour systems, this is exactly the same pattern we've seen before over the centuries. Secondly, there's a massive governance failure here. Most countries lack effective import controls. They're either unwilling or unable to prevent tainted products from entering their supply chains. Now, ironically enough, obviously, you may already know the US is an exception to this, but we can go into that later, perhaps. Thirdly, and this is crucial, I think, as well, we shouldn't be in the situation where it means false choices. A just transition requires not only eliminating forced labour, but transforming the economic structures that make such exploitation profitable in the first place. Researchers in another paper by the British Academy ask, what is the true cost of the pursuit of clean energy in terms of human freedom? And I think that has to be one of the things that we think about all the time if we're in this space. If our solar panels are built on Uyghur and other forced labour, on the exploitation of marginalised communities, on the dispossession of forest-dependent peoples, then I guess we haven't really achieved a just transition. We're just swapping one form of violence for another. Next slide, please. So I guess where does this leave us? From the papers that we've read and from some careful consideration and talking to people in our network, we've come to these conclusions in this first paper, I guess. I think we should be looking at a position where simply adding women to existing solar value chains, training more women engineers, giving women microloans, consulting communities after decisions are already made, this is insufficient. In fact, it can end up reinforcing underlying injustices by making exclusionary systems appear inclusive while leaving power structures intact. So I think we argue that achieving genuinely just transitions requires something much more fundamental. So it requires transforming the systems that create exclusion. A big ask, I know, but it means not just training more women engineers, which is good, is great, but it's insufficient. It means also transforming the masculine workplace cultures, the assumptions about physical capability, creating enabling environments, challenging the structures that systematically exclude women from technical and leadership roles. It means not just providing women with microloans, which again sounds progressive, but challenging the entire financial system that privileges male property ownership, that embeds patriarchal inheritance patterns into credit algorithms, for example. It's not just about consulting communities after projects are designed, which is pretty tokenistic. That is something that just checks a box. It's about redistributing decision-making power, so that affected populations, particularly women, particularly marginalised groups, have genuine co-governance and the right to say no. And I think this is the most critical thing. We have to reject the false choice between speed and justice, this kind of binary which we're always given. The climate crisis creates pressure for rapid deployment. Everybody here, I'm sure, understands that urgency, but this urgency is being weaponized at the moment, strategically weaponized to override justice concerns. When we're told we need to fast track land acquisitions, bypass consultation, overlook labour abuses because we need solar panels now, then that's the extractive logic of colonialism, repackaged as climate necessity. What some people call this kind of speed prioritization, all it ends up doing is reproducing the very patterns that we're claiming to move beyond: land grabbing, labour exploitation, community exclusion. So advancing climate justice requires building transitions that centre human rights, inclusion and ecological care. That's what we argue, not choosing between speed and justice. So what does that kind of transformation actually look like? Well, we suggest in this first report that it means like centering marginalized voices, so not just as beneficiaries who receive benefits designed by others, but as leaders and innovators who shape the transition. It means building local capacity. This is particularly important in our transforming energy access work at Swansea, but that means manufacturing, ownership, looking at value capture happening in communities rather than being extracted by external actors. And it means transforming governance. So that means accountability, it means transparency, genuine participation rather than performative consultation. We don't really think these are aspirational anymore. They're kind of the preconditions that we need really for durability, for legitimacy, and for a transition that might actually work. So next slide. I think I'm handing over to you, aren't I, Carol?
Oh, there you go. Hopefully I've got sound again. Yeah. Over to me again. And I can see where our time is marching on, but so I will quickly whiz through some of these slides, partly as well because I'm saying that around town, but also because we are working on the companion piece to the barriers to inclusivity paper, which is going to be called inclusion in the solar value chain, or that's our working title at the moment. So we are looking at 5 case studies that we've collected through the network in an attempt to try and address some of these quite clear-cut barriers that we've highlighted here in this one. So as Aelwyn said, this isn't aspirational. We really believe that this is achievable, but only really when inclusion is treated as a design principle rather than a downstream correction. So the cases that we've looked at, and we're still gathering, sort of span from pre-market innovation, so that's around inclusive market research, distribution, retail, installation, repair, and community governance. So it covers the core aspects that we've highlighted as part of this solar value chain, and how some of the case studies will work to specific, or we can match them to an extent, but things are never as clear cut as we'd like them to be, perhaps. But hopefully that is more realistic, and people that we have worked within our network to gather these case studies are actually actively taking part and doing these activities. So if you show the next slide. Brilliant, thank you. So I'm not going to go into this in detail because I have shamelessly lifted this from one of our delivery partners, Professor Nora Shikin-Ludin, and her team at the Solar Energy Research Institute, or SERI, in Kuala Lumpur. And so she's been taking part and conducting some inclusive market research. And we, just to sort of say, I mentioned earlier on Value for Women and the Global Disability Innovation Hub. Well, they were involved in designing a webinar that looked into how we could make sure that when we were looking at our market research, we were identifying the stakeholders. We were using approaches that made sure that we were involving, like the time frames that we were carrying these activities out. So it was all about how we are making sure we've got the stakeholders right. We're looking at the inclusion issues, what are the things that are important to the right stakeholders, where are the areas of friction, and how can we manage them. And the next slide. Thank you. And this is also, as I say, Professor Ludin's slide. So the slides are really, or the work that she's carrying out in this inclusive market research, are sort of setting the framework for and the foundation for the case study, sort of really grounding them. Because as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the data that we had access to was based around women in the aspects of the solar value chain, but there are also people living with disabilities around age, sexuality, different aspects that are not routinely gathered. So we can't base some of our work on information that we don't have. So right from the outset, we have to make sure that we're being inclusive when we're looking at the people who are likely to be the end users of the the solar, well, any aspect of the solar process. So if you have the next slide, please. And this Pawiri is participation of women in renewable energy. And again, thank you to Raminda Kaur and her team. And that's another Ayrton funded project. And that supports low carbon transitions in off-grid coastal communities, starting in South Sulawesi in Indonesia, and they're looking at near shore floating photovoltaic systems to replace fossil fuel reliance. But the approach that they're taking is an interdisciplinary collaboration, it's ethnography, and it's participatory action research. They aim to position women as co-owners and managers of the energy infrastructure, and they want to link the clean energy access to livelihood development, and it's including capacity building and long-term climate resilience by their approach. So at the moment they're in what they term in the pre-deployment grounding. But what they are keen to emphasize is that this grounding is not a delay of deployment. It's absolutely core and foundational for durable inclusion. You have to understand the energy needs of the communities as opposed to providing a structure, a technology, a service that has not taken into account the requirements of the community in the way that they currently operate. We have to try and make sure that we're not just providing something that people can't use effectively or efficiently, because it wasn't designed to their needs. So they're talking about governance, hardware and orgware, so the financial and business models and conflict resolution that must be addressed to actually ensure that you address concurrently to make sure of the success of the project. So they're really investing in the time up front. So that's that case study. And if you have the next slide, please. I keep trying to think I can move things on. So this is the last one that I was going to talk about briefly here. And this is Prio Sunsafe. And this really addresses, it addresses one of the issues that we mentioned in our barriers paper quite. It just completely maps onto it. So as we were saying, Kenya's rural off-grid markets, then they were noticing that there was an expertise needed to correctly design and size the solar systems that were going to be in use. But those were mainly operated by men, male technicians, who then, once they acquired the skills to be able to do such activities, then migrated to urban centres. So they were utilising their skills, but elsewhere. So women, while present and active in retail and sales roles, tended to lack the access to the technical knowledge that would give them the genuine authority and the skills and credibility to take part in these activities. So Prio and Sunsafe acknowledged this and thought, well, how are we going to go about addressing this issue? And so really looking at the problem from the requirements of the women. So it was a JESI lens that was adopted to focus the design of an Android application that automates system sizing calculations. So it makes the complex engineering decisions around accessibility and how you actually size the systems a bit more readily available to installers without really having an epic amount of technical training. So from its inception, it embedded this JESI lens. So they're not routinely excluded. It means, sorry, let me rephrase that. Women are not excluded because of a lack of interest or ability. They are excluded because of structural and cultural barriers. And this is what Prio and Sunsafe have really gone about in trying to consider when they've developed this app, and also the training modules that they've put in place to be able to ensure that people can use these in the communities that they're working. And that begins to shift the dynamics, as Aelwyn was mentioning in his last slides there. So I think that's essentially me in describing those very brief case studies. But as I said, the idea is that we are trying to then show real world examples, as we showed the real world examples of barriers that are in existence. We want to try and show what people are doing within our network to address these barriers. So did you want to briefly just summarize? I believe.
Just summarize. I guess if you go to that last couple of slides, really, I think we've probably repeated a few things here, but I think you probably all get the message now that what we're really trying to highlight here is that think about what this just and inclusive solar transition means, and I think our conclusion, I guess, in summary, is that it really requires addressing all these systemic barriers that prevent people, that stop people, especially women, especially marginalized groups, from participating and benefiting in this solar value chain. And I guess
think we have another slide.
Oh, are we in a? Yeah, sorry. In the next
there we go. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, I think that's what you were talking to. But
I guess I was just talking to myself. But I think what's been useful is using this JESI lens, and thinking about how. I mean, I guess one of our core things at Swansea, because we're doing lots of stuff around circular economy as well, is thinking about how you support locally led innovation, so that there's proper participation, and that's the only way that you're going to make this transition fair and effective, really. And I mean, as we've tried to highlight, really, to achieve this, you've got to move beyond commitments to accountability. It should be about financing that reaches women and community-led organisations properly, and that kind of and just having systems which acknowledge that basically knowledge and innovation has to include people, especially the people who are most affected by all these energy access issues. So I think that's it, isn't it? I think that's our thing. I think there's one more slide, but we're saying the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. So so I think maybe if we end up on the last slide, which actually sort of then has our QR code and says a little bit more about how people can access the Tea at Sunrise website potentially, or if people are interested and would like to join our network, we're keen on getting anybody else who would like to.
We're about how many? We're about 300
I believe, in the network.
330 or something, I think, by now. So I think we're growing quite quickly. I think through the kind of the WISE network and stuff, which you've highlighted, Carol. Which is Women in Solar Energy, which is part of this as well. It's just grown organically, hasn't it? Really, as a network.
Yeah. But please feel free if anybody wants to, if the last slide has got a QR code as opposed to a link. So if people would prefer a link, let us know. But that's you can just scan that in, and those are other social media ways to access us, and our emails as well if you wanted to get in touch.
We've got. I mean, we've got the report. The report itself is, how long is it? It's about 38 pages, I guess. It's it's relatively. It's a report. It's not an academic tome. It does take in a lot of the more recent sort of research that's out there, and it's designed to be pretty readable, isn't it, Carol? I think
hopefully.
So. Hopefully. So interestingly enough, we haven't really sort of it's been a more of an in-network publication up until now, hasn't it, Carol? Because I think the idea is that basically this is the kind of bad news and we're working on the good news.
Yeah.
Because what we found is that, we're asking a lot if we're going to dismantle all these systems. Let's face it, everybody here understands that it's a mammoth task. It's going to take a lot, but what we found through our network is that there are these really good case studies where things are seemingly changing, where it's happening, that people are really sort of beginning to question. And this is like across the board. It's across continents. It's not just in certain places. So yeah.